Totemist. Good evening, dear mortals. I am the totemist. Long ago, I lived countless human lives in my dreams and faced unfathomable horrors. Tonight, I shall share a few of those with you. May you live in peaceful times. Sandalwood and silver bowls. The smell of burning incense follows me everywhere now. Sweet sandalwood mixed with something else, something sharp and strange that I can't name. When I walk past temples in Seoul, that smell hits me like a punch to the stomach. My hands start shaking before my brain even knows why. I've thrown away all my scented candles. I can't risk catching that scent in my own home. I keep thinking about how it all started, about Seo-yeon. We had been friends since elementary school. Back when we were so small, we could share one umbrella walking home in the rain. She was always the brave one, the one who made life seem like an adventure. When other kids were afraid to climb the big oak tree in the schoolyard, Seo-yeon would go first, calling down to encourage me. When we were teenagers, she would talk to cute boys at the mall while I pretended to look at clothes nearby. I was happy being her shadow, the careful friend who kept her from floating too high or dreaming too big. That's why I noticed right away when she started to change. It happened slowly, like watching ice melt. First, she stopped meeting me for our Saturday morning coffee at our favorite cafe near Hongdae Station. We had gone there every week for 3 years. She always ordered an iced Americano, even in winter. I would get hot chocolate with extra whipped cream, and she would laugh at the cream mustache on my upper lip. Then her text messages became strange. Instead of sending me funny memes or complaining about her job at the accounting firm, she started writing things that didn't sound like her at all. "The physical world is just a shadow of truth," she wrote one day. "We are all sleeping, waiting to be awakened." When I asked what she meant, she would take hours to respond, sometimes days. The last time I saw her, before everything changed, was at a Korean barbecue restaurant near our old high school. The smell of grilling meat filled the air, and the sounds of sizzling and chopsticks clicking against metal bowls almost drowned out her voice when she told me she was going away for a while. "I need to find myself," she said, not meeting my eyes. Her food sat untouched on her plate, getting cold. "There's this retreat in the mountains. Some friends told me about it." I asked her which friends. I thought I knew all her friends, but she just smiled and shook her head. Her smile looked wrong somehow, like a photograph that's been edited too many times. That was the last time I saw the old Seo-yeon, the one who used to share my umbrella. Months passed. Autumn turned the leaves in Seoul's parks into flames of red and gold. Then winter came and buried everything under thick blankets of snow. I kept teaching English to elementary school kids, visiting my parents every Sunday for dinner, living my life like there wasn't a Seo-yeon-shaped hole in it. But sometimes I would catch myself setting out 2 teacups instead of one, or turning to share a joke with someone who wasn't there. One day, I was at E-Mart, shopping for groceries after work. It was that strange time of day when the afternoon is dying, but evening hasn't quite arrived yet. When the store feels empty and huge and slightly unreal. The familiar nickname stopped me in my tracks. I knew that voice, but it felt different than usual, lighter, airier, like someone speaking in a dream. I turned around slowly, holding a package of ramyeon. Seo-yeon stood at the end of the aisle, but she didn't look like Seo-yeon anymore. Her hair, which she had always kept dyed light brown, was now pure black and perfectly straight, falling past her shoulders like a silk curtain. She wore a white linen dress, even though it was the middle of winter, with no coat or scarf. We stood there for a moment, the distance between us filled with unspoken questions. The Seo-yeon, I knew, would have rushed forward for a hug, would have burst into excited chatter about where she'd been. This Seo-yeon remained still, her posture perfect, her smile serene but somehow rehearsed. Would you like to get coffee? She asked, her voice carrying that same dreamlike quality, and I agreed. Our old cafe was just around the corner, but she led me to a different place, a stark, minimalist shop I'd never noticed before. The walls were white, the chairs metallic and angular. No music played. She didn't order her usual iced Americano. Instead, she requested hot water with a precise temperature. As we sat, I noticed how her movements followed an invisible pattern, the way she placed her cup exactly parallel to the table's edge, how she blinked at measured intervals. We talked about small things at first, my teaching job, the weather, my parents. But something was off about her responses. She spoke about everyday matters as if translating them from another language, her words carefully chosen, yet somehow hollow. It took 3 more meetings like this before she began to hint at what had changed her. Each time, she wore white. Each time, her posture grew more perfect, her movements more measured. She would drop fragments into our conversations about finding inner truth, about transcending physical limitations, about a special place where people truly understood the nature of reality. There's something I want to share with you, she said during our 4th meeting, reaching across the table to touch my hand. Her fingers were cool and dry, like autumn leaves. Something amazing. Something that will change everything, yeah. Something that will wake us all up. The lights in the cafe flickered, making shadows dance across her face. Her eyes were too bright, like she had a fever. She began telling me about a place in the mountains near Gangwon-do. She described teachers who knew secret truths, meditation sessions, and moments of understanding that felt like being struck by lightning. Every word she spoke was perfect, each sentence flowing into the next like practiced poetry. Seo-yeon used to talk in bursts and fragments, interrupting herself with laughter or random thoughts. But this new Seo-yeon spoke like she was reading from a script. You've always understood me better than anyone, she said. Come see for yourself, just once. That's all I'm asking. And before I knew it, I was nodding, like she had lulled me into a trance, and I couldn't say no. That weekend, we took a bus into the mountains. The road wound higher and higher through clouds that clung to the mountainsides like cotton. Seo-yeon sat perfectly straight beside me, hands folded in her lap like a statue. She hummed something under her breath. Not really a song, more like a pattern of notes or mantra. The temple of eternal light appeared through the mist like something from a dream or a nightmare. Traditional Korean temple architecture mixed with modern buildings made of gleaming wood and steel. The windows reflected the gray sky like mirrors, making it impossible to see inside. People dressed all in white moved between the buildings like ghosts, their faces peaceful and empty. "Welcome, sisters," they said as we walked past, but their eyes looked through me like I was made of glass. Inside the main hall, hundreds of people sat in perfectly straight rows on cushions, all facing a stage where a man in elaborate robes was speaking. His voice was deep and smooth, like honey being poured. He talked about purification, about moving beyond human limitations, about a great transformation that was coming soon. Seo-yeon's hand gripped mine harder when I shifted uncomfortably on my cushion. That's when I started noticing things that made my blood run cold. Everyone was breathing at exactly the same time, their chests rising and falling like they were one organism. Their bodies swayed slightly all together, like seaweed in an invisible current. A young man near me had blood trickling from his nose, but he kept smiling, staring straight ahead like he didn't even notice. "Isn't it beautiful?" Seo-yeon whispered, her breath tickling my ear. "Soon you'll understand too. Soon you'll see the light." I mumbled something about needing the bathroom and stood up. The corridors outside the main hall were a maze of white walls and closed doors. Behind one door, I heard people chanting in a language I didn't recognize. Behind another, someone was crying, but the sobs came at perfect, regular intervals, like a metronome. As I turned to leave, cold fingers wrapped around my wrist. An elderly woman in white robes stood before me, her face serene, but her eyes sharp as winter frost. "The purification is beginning," she said, her voice carrying that same hollow resonance I'd heard in Seo-yeon's. "You must join us. The light has chosen you." She led me, her grip unwavering, through corridors that seemed to pulse with the distant sound of drums. We emerged into a circular courtyard I hadn't noticed before. Hundreds of white-robed figures stood in concentric circles around a central altar of polished black stone. A black goat stood tethered to the altar, its eyes reflecting the torchlight like mirrors. The man in elaborate robes, the one who had been speaking earlier, stood behind it, holding a curved knife. His smile was gentle, loving even, as he began to chant. "The vessel carries the light," the crowd responded in perfect unison. "The blood carries the truth." Seo-yeon appeared beside me, her face radiant with that terrible serenity. "Watch carefully," she whispered. "This is how we begin to wake up." The knife descended. The goat's cry merged with the chanting, creating a sound that made reality itself seem to waver. Blood ran in precisely straight lines down the altar's channels, collected in silver bowls that gleamed like mirrors in the torchlight. "Approach," the robed man commanded, his voice gentle, but carrying an undertone that made my bones ache. "Taste the truth. Kiss the vessel that carried the light." One by one, the white-robed figures moved forward. They pressed their lips to the goat's severed head, then drank from the silver bowls. Some emerged with blood on their chins, their eyes shining with that same feverish light I'd seen in Seo-yeon's. When the elderly woman's grip loosened for a moment, I ran. The forest swallowed me in darkness. Branches tore at my clothes as I stumbled through the undergrowth, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear the sounds of pursuit. But they were there. Footsteps moving in perfect rhythm, flashlight beams cutting through the trees like searching fingers, voices chanting in that language that made my head spin. I found a bus stop on a mountain road, its single light creating a pool of sickly yellow in the darkness. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope. Then, white shapes emerged from the shadows, moving with that terrible, synchronized grace. They didn't grab me or speak. They simply formed a circle and waited, knowing I had nowhere else to go. Back in the courtyard, they held me gently but firmly. The silver bowl was cool against my lips. The liquid tasted of metal and something else, something that made colors blur and sounds stretch like taffy. The world began to fold in on itself, origami style, as they led me to a small white room with a narrow bed. I woke to sunlight and nausea so intense the world spun. Seo-yeon sat beside my bed, stroking my hair with rhythmic movements. "The first awakening is always difficult," she said, her voice distant through the pounding in my head. "But I can help you heal. Soon, you won't feel the pain at all. Soon, you'll only feel the light." They hadn't posted a guard. Why would they? Most people could barely walk after the ceremony. But I had been faking the depth of my unconsciousness, taking only small sips when they forced the bowl to my lips. When Seo-yeon left to get healing tea, I pulled myself up, fighting the dizziness and nausea. This time, I didn't run blindly. I walked, forcing myself to move naturally, even though my legs shook. Past white-robed figures who smiled serenely, assuming I was just another initiate going about their duties. Through the gardens where others sat in meditation, their breathing synchronized. Out through a small gate where delivery trucks brought food and supplies. I walked for 2 hours along the mountain road before a car stopped. The elderly couple inside took one look at my pale face and torn white clothes and drove me all the way back to Seoul, murmuring prayers under their breath. Last week, a letter arrived. The paper was pure white and smelled of sandalwood, mixed with that other sharp scent I finally recognized. Blood. "We miss you, sister," it said in Seo-yeon's perfect handwriting. "The light misses you too. The vessel awaits. It's time to complete your awakening." The dark between stars. I always felt more at home staring at the night sky than being around people. While other teenagers hung out in groups at cafes and karaoke rooms in Daejeon, I spent my nights alone on my roof with my telescope. The stars never laughed at me for being quiet. The planets never walked away when I couldn't find the right words to say. High school was 3 years of sitting alone at lunch, watching other kids share their food and stories while I picked at my young bap and dreamed of distant galaxies. Teachers called me the ghost because I barely spoke in class. Some days, I wondered if I really was becoming invisible, fading away like starlight at dawn. Starting college at KAIST didn't change much. The campus buildings were all sharp corners and glass, and students moved between them in their tight groups, laughing and talking. I watched them from the edges, feeling like a shadow that didn't quite fit anywhere. My dorm room became my new observatory. I set up my telescope by the window and spent more time watching Mars than trying to make friends. My thermodynamics class met in a big lecture hall that made me feel even smaller. I always sat in the back, where the lights weren't so bright. From there, I could watch everyone without them noticing me, And this is the place and time where I first saw Min-jun. He sat by himself 2 rows ahead of me, drawing in his notebook while Professor Young talked about heat and energy. While other students typed notes on their laptops, Min-jun's hand moved carefully across the paper, making detailed pictures I couldn't quite see. During breaks, when everyone else chatted with their friends, he stayed in his seat, lost in his own world. Something about his stillness reminded me of myself. I noticed the patches on his bag first, pictures of galaxies and star clusters. One of them showed the Horsehead Nebula, the same one I'd spent countless nights trying to photograph through my telescope. The patch was worn around the edges, like he'd had it for years. "That's a hard one to get a good picture of," I said, before I could stop myself. "The dark part against the glowing background." Min-jun looked up quickly, surprised. His eyes studied me carefully before he spoke. "You take pictures of space?" His voice was quiet but clear, like he chose each word carefully. "Just amateur stuff," I said, pointing at his bag. "But I recognize those numbers you were writing. They're for the TRAPPIST-1 star system, right?" A small smile changed his whole face. "Most people think they're just random numbers." He opened his notebook to show me pages filled with calculations and orbit patterns. "I'm trying to find which planets might support life. What Professor Jung says about energy applies perfectly to how planets' atmospheres work." We stayed in the empty classroom that afternoon, talking about planets and the possibility of aliens. Min-jun spoke with such excitement that it made the room feel warmer somehow. For the first time since coming to KIST, I didn't feel so alone. Here was someone else who understood the beauty of empty space, who saw patterns in the darkness that others missed. We started spending more time together, studying late at night, and always ending up talking about space. Min-jun's dorm room became like a second home to me. The walls were covered in star maps and complicated math equations. The smell of instant noodles and coffee made it feel comfortable and safe. He had a mini fridge full of energy drinks and a desk lamp that projected stars onto the ceiling. Sometimes we'd lie on the floor, watching the fake constellations spin above us while discussing the possibility of life on other worlds. But as fall turned to winter, something started to change in our talks. Min-jun's interest in habitable planets turned into something more urgent, almost scary. His notebook was filled with messy writing about how Earth was dying. The numbers and calculations got more frantic, as if he was trying to solve a problem that kept getting worse. The star projector gathered dust as he spent more time hunched over his desk, muttering about atmospheric decay and DNA preservation. "The math doesn't lie, Beiko," he would say, his voice taking on a strange, metallic sound. "Our atmosphere is failing. We have to save our DNA. Send it to Mars before it's too late." When he talked like this, his eyes looked far away, like he was seeing something I couldn't. The comfortable feeling in his room disappeared, replaced by a heaviness that made it hard to breathe. I first noticed his collection in late November. Small glass tubes lined up on his desk, each with a label showing dates and places. They held pieces of hair, fingernail clippings, and spots of dried blood on paper. Some tubes had names I recognized, students from our class. When I asked about them, Min-jun's voice became cold and distant, like he was speaking from the bottom of a deep well. "I'm testing how to preserve samples," he said, touching the tubes gently. "We need to know how different DNA samples handle radiation and extreme temperatures." His fingers moved over the glass like he was playing piano. "Would you like to contribute to the research, Beko?" your genetic material could be the key to everything. The question made me disturbed. The light hit the glass tubes and scattered across his face in tiny rainbows, making him look almost alien. I made up an excuse about studying and left, trying not to think about how his eyes followed me to the door, or how the star projector cast strange shadows that seemed to reach for me as I hurried out. After that night, I started noticing weird things. I'd find strands of my hair on his desk, even though I hadn't given them to him. My missing pencil showed up in his collection, the chewed end sealed in a container. His notebooks had notes about my height, weight, and blood type, things I'd never told him. Pages of calculations now included my name, circled and connected to complex formulas about genetic preservation and Mars colonization. When I tried to avoid him, Min-jun seemed to be everywhere. He'd appear outside my classes, in the library, in the cafeteria. Sometimes I'd wake up at night and see a figure standing outside my dorm window, gone when I looked again. "The research can't wait," he'd whisper whenever he caught me, his voice filled with the same excitement he used to have talking about stars. "You don't understand how little time we have. Earth is dying, Beko, but you could help save everyone." The night everything changed, I fell asleep studying in the library. The quiet hum of the heaters made me feel safe, and the late hour meant I was almost alone. Almost. When I opened my eyes, I was under bright laboratory lights. Cold metal straps held my wrists and ankles, and the air smelled sharp and clean, like a hospital. Classical music played softly from somewhere nearby. Mozart's Stargazer Symphony, Min-jun's favorite. And there he was. Min-jun leaned over me, his face looking strange in the harsh light. Behind him, walls of glass tubes caught the light, each one holding carefully saved pieces of people. Names and dates lined every surface. A catalog of humanity waiting to be saved. "I had to do it this way," he said, getting a needle ready with steady hands. "You'll understand later. Your DNA is special, perfect for the next phase of testing." He talked about it the same way he used to talk about stars, like this was just another science experiment. "I've been watching you since the first day of class, Beko. Your genetic structure shows remarkable resilience. You're exactly what the project needs. The solution has to be perfect before we send it to Mars," he said, the needle gleaming like a faraway star. "Thank you, Beko, for helping save humanity. Isn't it beautiful? We'll finally be among the stars. Your DNA will help create a new generation of humans adapted for life on Mars. Every strand of your hair, every drop of blood, it's all part of humanity's future." The last thing I saw before the drugs made me sleep was Min-jun's smile, as cold as space itself. They found me 2 days later in what the police called a makeshift laboratory in an abandoned research building on the edge of campus. Min-jun was gone, vanished like a shooting star. All he left behind were his tubes of saved human pieces and notebooks full of numbers pointing to places on Mars. The police didn't understand his notes, but I did. They were coordinates, recipes for recreating human life on another world. My name appeared on every page, marked as Primary Subject A. The hospital kept me for 2 weeks. My hair grows back differently now, and sometimes I find small scars I don't remember getting. The doctors say I wasn't physically harmed, but I know better. Min-jun took what he needed: blood, tissue, bone marrow. all for his greater purpose. I can't stop talking about his notebooks, not the formulas or the cosmic coordinates, but the margins, filled with intimate details about everyone he'd collected. He knew which students stayed late in the library, who lived alone, who wouldn't be missed for a few days. We weren't people to him anymore, just raw material for his grand vision of humanity's future. Sweet offerings. I remember everything about Jeju differently now. The memories feel wrong, like photos that have been changed. Even the good parts have something dark hiding in them, like sugar that tastes strange. Ariam and I moved there in early spring. The cherry trees were in full bloom, with pink petals falling like snow. We'd left our busy life in Seoul for this quieter place, this island where the sea went on forever, and time seemed to move more slowly. The streets had old black stone walls on both sides, walls that had been there longer than anyone could remember. Every house had its own story, its own secrets. Our new house was in a quiet part of town, far from the tourist spots and big hotels. The tiny front yard had 3 tangerine trees, their little green fruit not ready to eat yet. The previous owner had taken good care of them. "We'll raise our kids here," Ariam said as we stood in our empty living room, holding hands. When she smiled, I could see all our hopes for the future. The ones we'd talked about late at night in our cramped Seoul apartment. Everything seemed perfect at first. We had morning coffee on our tiny porch. We walked to the market together. We talked about paint colors and curtains and all the normal things new homeowners talk about. But then we started to notice how alone we were. None of the neighbors talked to us. They just nodded quickly when we passed them on the street, like they were afraid to look at us too long. At the market, people would stop talking when we got close, then start whispering once we walked away. We felt like outsiders, and that feeling got heavier every day. Then Mrs. Kim showed up. She brought us rice cakes, still hot from cooking. Steam rose from them in the cool spring air. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said with a big smile. "I live across the street." She pointed to a small house with dark windows and a red front door. Something about her filled up our whole house, like she was bigger than she looked. She walked around like she knew where everything was, even though she'd never been there before. She kept saying, "Young couples need someone to look after them," and wouldn't leave until we'd eaten all the rice cakes. They tasted sweet, but there was something else in the taste, something that tasted like metal and dirt. I brushed my teeth 3 times that night, but couldn't get rid of it. She started coming every day, always with different sweets: honey cookies that stuck to our teeth, sugar pancakes that burned our tongues, fish-shaped pastries filled with sweet beans. While we ate, she told stories about the neighborhood and the families who'd lived there. Her voice would change when she told these stories, sometimes smooth like honey, sometimes sharp like broken glass. "You're too skinny," she would tell Ariam, pushing more sweets at her. "How will you have healthy babies if you don't eat enough?" At first, we were happy she came around. She was our only friend in town. But then her visits started feeling wrong. She'd show up at strange times, sometimes when the moon was high and the streets were empty. If we didn't answer the door right away, we'd find her standing in our yard, staring at our windows. The tangerine trees seemed to bend away from her, and I felt the same. I didn't like her behavior and was growing more frustrated with Mrs. Kim's sudden appearances. Ariam and I started fighting about her. Small arguments at first, then bigger ones. "She's just a lonely old lady," Ariam would say, but I noticed how her hands trembled when we heard knocking late at night. Still, she ate everything Mrs. Kim brought, often starting immediately after Mrs. Kim whispered something to her, like she couldn't stop herself. We fought more and more. About Mrs. Kim, about the house, about everything. Our voices echoed off the stone walls of our yard. Sometimes I'd see Mrs. Kim watching from across the street, smiling in the dark. The tangerine trees started dying, their leaves curling up like fists. The fruit turned black and fell off, making soft thumps in the night that sounded like footsteps. Then Ariam got sick. First headaches that made her cry, then stomach pains that made her curl up in bed. She got pale and stopped eating regular food, but she still ate Mrs. Kim's sweets. "They make me feel better," she said, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking, and her eyes looked glassy and strange. Sometimes she talked in her sleep, in a voice that didn't sound like hers. Mrs. Kim came more often now. She'd just appear in our kitchen, even when we knew we'd locked the doors. We started keeping all the windows shut, but it didn't matter. She always got in. "You need to eat to keep up your strength," she'd say, pulling out steaming hot sweets from nowhere. One night, I woke up and saw Mrs. Kim standing in our bedroom doorway. The sight filled me with fright and sudden anger. This constant violation of our privacy had gone too far. "This is inappropriate," I said firmly, taking the plate from her hands. "You need to leave. Now." She didn't move at first, just stood there staring. When I moved to guide her out, her kind grandmother act disappeared. Something cold showed in her eyes. Without a word, I walked her to the front door and shut it firmly. Through the window, I watched her stand motionless in our garden. She turned her head to look back at the house, a slow, deliberate movement that made my skin crawl. In the moonlight, her face held such hatred that I stepped back from the window. Ariam collapsed the next morning. I found her in the kitchen, her body twisted unnaturally. Her eyes were open and incredibly odd, as if her pupils had changed shape, becoming almost rectangular like a goat's eyes. When we got to the hospital, doctors kept calling in more specialists, their faces growing more confused with each new test result they ran on Ariam. "Her blood work shows impossible changes," one doctor told another, when they thought I couldn't hear. "Under the microscope, her blood cells move in strange patterns, forming shapes that looked like ancient writing before breaking apart and reforming," the doctor elaborated. The toxicology reports were even more disturbing. Turns out Mrs. Kim's sweets contained traces of poisonous plants, nightshade, belladonna, things that could cause hallucinations. She had combined traditional medicinal plants in ways that made them dangerous. Doctors found evidence that she'd been slowly poisoning Ariam for months. When police searched Mrs. Kim's house, they found books about plants and handwritten recipes. Her notes detailed exactly how different combinations affected people. They discovered similar cases in other towns, young couples who got sick and moved away. But Mrs. Kim had disappeared. When our story became public, the neighbors finally told us everything. Other couples had lived in our house before. At first, everyone was young and happy. They all met the woman across the street, and after some time, changes began, first in their eyes, then their voices, and finally, the way they moved. They all vanished eventually, leaving empty houses that smelled sweet. Some neighbors said they'd seen Mrs. Kim for decades, never aging. always bringing sweets to new couples. Ariam survived, but we can't have children now. The sweets changed something in Ariam's body that doctors don't understand. But I don't think that's what Mrs. Kim really wanted. I keep thinking about all those other couples who left the island. I wonder what really happened to them.